The city at night was a symphony of its own, but not the kind you'd find in a concert hall. It was a messy mix of car horns, distant sirens, and the buzz of neon signs. Tucked away on a quieter street was a place called the Velvet Note. From the outside, it wasn't much to look at, just a simple dark door and a small, glowing sign. But inside, it was a different world. The air was warm and smelled of old wood, coffee, and the faint, sweet scent of whiskey. Soft lights hung over small round tables, their surfaces worn smooth by countless elbows and glass bottoms. The heart of the room was the stage, and on that stage stood a grand piano. Its dark wood shone under a single, warm spotlight, looking both proud and lonely. This was a place for jazz, for the kind of music that felt like a secret being whispered just to you. And on Tuesday nights, the secret was open to anyone brave enough to share it. It was open mic night. The man who ran these nights was the owner, a big, friendly man with a beard and a laugh that made you feel like you were in on the joke. He moved between the tables, welcoming regulars and newcomers alike. The real boss on these nights, though, was the crowd. A mix of students with their notebooks, couples on dates, and serious music lovers who nodded along with closed eyes, judging every note. But long after these people had all gone home, when the last glass was emptied and the final chord had faded into silence, the club belonged to one man. His name was Leo. Leo was the janitor. He was a man in his late 50s with a quiet way of moving that made it easy to forget he was even there. His hair was more gray than black, and his face was lined with the stories of a long life. His hands, which he often shoved into the pockets of his work coat, were rough and strong, with knuckles that were slightly swollen from years of hard work. While the musicians played, Leo stayed in the shadows at the back of the room, leaning on his mop, watching. He never clapped too loudly or complained. He was just a silent part of the scenery, like a chair or a wall. When the last customer stumbled out into the night, laughing, that's when Leo's work truly began. The bright lights would flick on, washing away the magical, moody glow. The spell was broken. Then the only sounds were the scrape of chairs on the floor, the clink of bottles as he collected them into a crate, and the swish of his mop in a bucket of soapy water. He worked slowly and carefully. He would wipe down every table, making sure no sticky rings were left behind. He would clean the bathrooms until they sparkled. But everyone noticed that he spent the most time on the stage. He would dust the piano with a special soft cloth, running it over the lid and along the legs with a kind of respect. He would polish the piano's keys until they gleamed under the work lights, white and black like a row of perfect teeth. One of the regular performers at the open mic was a young pianist. He was a talented guy, no doubt about it. His fingers could fly across the keyboard faster than the eye could follow. He played complicated songs that were full of wild, dizzying notes. He liked the music that made people gasp and then clap loudly when he finished. This young man had a lot of confidence, which sometimes tipped over into arrogance. He loved the spotlight. He loved the moment after a song when the room erupted in applause and all eyes were on him. He practiced on the club's grand piano during the quiet afternoons, and he often saw Leo going about his work. The young pianist didn't mean to be unkind. He just saw the world in a simple way. There were musicians and there were everyone else. To him, Leo was part of the everyone else. He was the man who cleaned up the mess. Sometimes when the young man was taking a break from practicing, he would see Leo mopping the floor near the stage. He'd give him a small, polite smile. It wasn't a warm smile between friends. It was the kind of smile you give someone you feel a little sorry for. "Hey, careful with the water near the piano legs, okay?" the young man would say, his voice light but with a hint of command. Leo would just nod, his eyes on his work. "Of course," he'd say in his quiet, low voice. He would then move his mop and bucket further away, giving the musician and his instrument a wide space. The young man would turn back to the piano, thinking about the next difficult part of his music. He never wondered if Leo liked music. He never wondered what those old, tired eyes saw when they looked at the piano. To him, Leo was just part of the background, a quiet, moving piece of the furniture. He had no idea that the old janitor was storing away every note he played, every chord he practiced, listening from the back of the empty room while he polished the glasses and put the chairs on the tables, creating a different kind of music in the quiet of the night. The night it happened started like any other open mic night at the Velvet Note. The room was about half full, a decent crowd for a Tuesday. A soft murmur of conversation filled the air, punctuated by the clink of glasses and the occasional low laugh. The owner moved through the room with a tray, his easy smile making everyone feel welcome. The young pianist was there, of course. He was sitting at a table near the front with a few of his friends, all of them fellow musicians. He was leaning back in his chair, looking confident and relaxed. He was scheduled to play later, and he was already enjoying the feeling of anticipation. One by one, performers took the stage. A young woman with a guitar sang a sweet, sad song about leaving home. A man with a trumpet played a bluesy tune that made people tap their feet. The crowd applauded politely for each one. The young pianist listened, but a part of his mind was already on his own performance, on the complex piece he would play to wow everyone. From the back of the room, Leo went about his work. He moved quietly, collecting empty glasses and wiping down tables that had been left wet from condensation. His movements were slow and efficient, a dance he had done 1,000 times before. His eyes, however, kept drifting towards the stage, especially when the young pianist's friends were performing. He would pause for a moment, his cloth still on the table, and just listen. Finally, it was the young pianist's turn. The owner announced his name, and he walked up to the stage, a spring in his step. He settled onto the piano bench, straightened his back, and let his hands hover over the keys for a dramatic second. Then he began. His piece was, as always, incredibly difficult. His fingers were a blur racing up and down the keyboard. The music was loud, fast, and full of energy. It was like a musical storm. He hit complex chords and ran through scales at a breathtaking speed. He poured all his technical skill into it, his body moving with the force of his playing. When he finished, he let the last powerful chord hang in the air before snapping his hands away from the keys. The reaction was instant. The crowd burst into strong, enthusiastic applause. People whistled and cheered. It was the biggest reaction of the night. A wide, proud smile spread across the young man's face. He stood up and took a deep, theatrical bow, soaking in the admiration. He stepped off the stage, his heart still pounding with the thrill of performance. His friends clapped him on the back, offering congratulations. "That was insane, man," one of them said. "You wiped the floor with everyone else tonight," said another. The young man grinned, feeling untouchable. This was his element. This was where he belonged. As he made his way back to his table, he noticed Leo. The janitor was standing off to the side of the room near the corner of the stage. He wasn't cleaning or moving. He was just standing there looking at the piano. He had a strange expression on his face. It wasn't admiration or awe. It was something else, something thoughtful, almost distant, as if he was remembering a dream. The young pianist, still buzzing from his success, found this funny. What could this old man, who spent his life cleaning up spills, possibly be thinking about that grand piano? Didn't he know it was an instrument for artists, for people with real talent? Feeling bold and a little bit cruel from his triumph, the young man decided to say something. He walked over to Leo, his friends watching with curious smiles. "See something you like, old man?" the young pianist asked, his voice loud and cheerful, still riding the high of the applause. "Thinking of giving it a try yourself?" A few people at the nearby tables heard him and turned to look. They chuckled softly, not out of malice, but because the idea of the quiet janitor playing the piano seemed absurd. Leo seemed to come back from his faraway thoughts. He looked at the young man, and for a second a deep sadness flashed in his eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it came. He didn't say anything. He just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he started walking. He didn't walk towards his mop and bucket. He walked straight towards the stage. A wave of surprised whispers went through the room. The owner, who was behind the bar, stopped drying a glass and watched, his eyebrows raised. The young pianist's smile faltered for a second, replaced by confusion. What was this old guy doing? Leo stepped onto the stage. He stood before the grand piano, looking at it not as a piece of furniture to be cleaned, but as an old friend. He slowly reached out and ran his rough, work-worn fingers along the edge of the polished wood. The young man watched, his initial confusion turning into amusement. This was going to be a hilarious end to the night. He looked at his friends and couldn't stop himself. He let out a short, sharp chuckle. It was a sound that wasn't mean-spirited, but it was full of disbelief and a sense of superiority. He leaned over to his friend and whispered, just loud enough for several people to hear. "This should be good." Try not to get any bleach on the ivories, Leo. A few more people in the audience laughed this time. The tension broke. They all settled in, expecting a funny, awkward moment. They thought they were about to see a man make a fool of himself. Leo, however, seemed completely unaware of the laughter. He pulled out the piano bench and sat down. The bench creaked under his weight. He looked small and out of place under the bright stage lights. He stared at the keys, a sea of black and white that had been his to care for but never to play. He didn't wiggle his fingers or crack his knuckles like a concert pianist. He didn't take a deep, dramatic breath. He simply placed his rough, thick fingers gently on the keys. They were the hands of a laborer, hands that knew how to grip a mop and lift heavy crates. They looked all wrong on the delicate ivory. He closed his eyes. The room was quiet now, waiting. Some people were still smiling, expecting a clumsy, childish tune or maybe just a single, wrong note followed by an embarrassed retreat. The young pianist folded his arms across his chest, a confident smirk still playing on his lips. He was ready for the joke to begin. He had no idea that the joke was about to be on him. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence in the room felt heavy and thick. The old janitor sat perfectly still on the piano bench, his eyes closed, his rough hands resting on the keys. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats, feeling a little awkward. The young pianist, standing with his friends, let out a quiet, impatient sigh. He thought the old man was just stalling, maybe trying to find the courage to back down. Then Leo moved, his shoulders relaxed. He took a slow, soft breath that was almost a whisper. And then he began to play. The first sound wasn't a melody. It was a single deep note from the lower part of the piano. It was a low, resonant sound that hung in the air like a distant bell. Then came another, and another, not in a rush, but slowly, thoughtfully, like footsteps on a quiet street late at night. This wasn't the wild, exciting storm of notes the young pianist had played. This was different. This was the sound of memory. This was the sound of a story being told without any words. A simple melody began to rise from the bass notes. It was a sad tune, but it wasn't the kind of sadness that makes you cry. It was a beautiful, gentle sadness, the kind you feel when you remember someone you loved long ago. The notes were slow and clear, each one given its own space to breathe and ring out in the quiet room. The few smiles that were left in the audience vanished. The feeling of waiting for a joke was gone, replaced by a sudden, deep curiosity. People stopped looking at each other and leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the old man on the stage. They were listening, really listening. The owner, who had been wiping the bar, put his cloth down and didn't pick it up again. He just stared, his mouth slightly open. The young pianist felt the first small twist of something strange in his stomach. His confident posture loosened. His arms, which had been folded tightly across his chest, dropped to his sides. This was not what he had expected. This wasn't someone pretending to play. This was control. This was feeling. Leo's body moved gently with the music, not with wild energy, but with a slow, deep rhythm, as if the music was flowing up from the floor, through his body, and out through his fingertips. His calloused hands, which looked so out of place, now seemed to belong perfectly on the keys. They weren't just hitting notes. They were talking to the piano. They were pressing, caressing, and lifting with a tenderness that was astonishing to see. The music began to build. The left hand started a steady walking pattern like a heartbeat, while the right hand's melody became more complex. It wove in little twists and turns, moments of hope that peeked through the sadness like sunlight through a cloudy sky. You could almost see pictures in the music. You could imagine a young man full of dreams. You could feel the ache of a goodbye, and you could sense a quiet strength that had endured through many years. This was not a famous song anyone recognized. This was something he had made up himself. This was his own story, written in notes and chords. The young pianist was no longer smirking. He was just staring, his mind struggling to catch up with what his ears were hearing. He listened to the way Leo's left hand held down a complex chord, making the piano's strings vibrate with a rich, full sound. He watched how his right hand played a run of notes that was not fast and flashy, but was so expressive and perfect that it made his heart hurt. It was a technique he had spent years trying to master, the technique of making the instrument sing with emotion, not just speed. He thought about his own performance just minutes before. He had played a torrent of notes, a display of raw power and skill. He had wanted to amaze people with how difficult it was. But this old man was amazing people with how true it was. He wasn't playing to impress a crowd. He seemed to be playing for himself, for a memory. And the room was just lucky enough to be allowed to listen. The young man's friend, who had laughed with him earlier, leaned over and whispered, his voice full of awe. He's really good." The young pianist couldn't even answer. He just gave a slow, stunned nod. The chuckle he had let out now felt like a dirty spot on his conscience. The joke he had made about bleach on the ivories echoed in his mind, making him feel small and foolish. He looked at Leo's face. Under the warm stage light, the deep lines around his eyes and mouth were clear. They were not just lines of age, he realized. They were lines of experience. They were lines from a life that had known both joy and pain. And all of that life was now pouring out through his fingers into the piano, filling the velvet note with a beauty that was so real you could almost touch it. The young man, who had felt like a king just a few minutes ago, now felt like a student. No, he felt like a child. He had been so busy showing off how high he could climb. He never stopped to think about how deep the music could go. He stood there, in the middle of the room, and the arrogance that had been his armor simply melted away. He was not being silenced by someone louder. He was being silenced by someone deeper. He was hearing a language he always thought he spoke, but now realized he was only just beginning to understand. The masterpiece had only just begun, and it had already changed everything. The music did not stay in its place of quiet sadness. It began to change, to grow. The steady heartbeat from the left hand grew a little stronger, a little more sure of itself. The right hand's melody, which had been crying, now seemed to be wiping its tears and looking up at the sky. It swelled into something new. A wave of sound rose from the piano, not loud and crashing, but powerful and deep, like a wide, slow-moving river. The simple, sad tune transformed. It became richer, filled with complex chords that made the air in the room feel thick with feeling. It was no longer just a memory of pain. It was the story of what came after the pain. It was the sound of getting back up. It was the sound of a quiet strength that had been forged in difficult times. Leo's body moved with this new energy. His shoulders, once slumped in his work coat, were now straight. His head was tilted back slightly, his eyes still closed, completely lost in the world he was creating. His rough, thick fingers were now dancing. They flew across the keys, but it was a different kind of speed from the young pianist's performance. This was not a race. This was a journey. Every note had a purpose, a place in the story. He played runs and flourishes that were technically brilliant, but they never felt like they were there to show off. They felt like moments of sudden clarity, like bursts of understanding in a long and complicated life. He blended styles together in a way that was magical. You could hear the soulful ache of the blues in the bending of the notes. You could hear the sophisticated, thoughtful harmonies of jazz, and underneath it all, there was the solid, beautiful structure of classical music, holding everything together like a strong backbone. This was not just one kind of music. This was the music of a whole life all mixed up together. The people in the room were not just listening anymore. They were feeling it in their bones. A woman at a small table had forgotten about her drink. Her hand was resting on her chest as if trying to slow her heart. A man had taken off his glasses and was cleaning them, not because they were dirty, but because his eyes had gotten wet and he didn't want anyone to see. The owner of the club stood behind the bar, his arms crossed, a look of pure wonder on his face. He was seeing the man he had hired to clean floors for the first time. The real man. But the most powerful change was happening in the young pianist. The confident, proud young man was gone. The person standing there now looked like his shell had been cracked open. All the color had drained from his face. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on Leo's hands. He could see it all now. He saw the technique that was in its own way more advanced than his own. He saw the control, the touch, the way Leo could make a single note sing with so much emotion that it felt like a whole sentence. He listened, and his mind was reeling. He recognized the musical ideas. He had studied them in school. He had tried to practice them for years, but he had always used them as decorations, as tricks to make people clap. He had never understood that they were meant to be used like this, as words in a story, as colors in a painting. The memory of his own performance came back to him, and it felt empty and noisy compared to this. He had been shouting. Leo was speaking from the heart. He had been trying to conquer the piano. Leo was having a conversation with it. A hot wave of shame washed over him, so strong it made him feel weak. His own chuckle, the one he had let out when Leo sat down, now echoed in his mind. It sounded so cruel, so foolish. He thought about his joke about the bleach, and he felt sick to his stomach. He had been looking down on this man, this artist, this master from a great height, but now he realized he had been the one down in the valley, looking up at a mountain he never even knew was there. His friend next to him whispered, "I can't believe it." The young pianist just shook his head slowly. He couldn't speak. There were no words. The music was saying everything that needed to be said. He wasn't just hearing a song. He was receiving a lesson about life, about humility, about where real music comes from. It doesn't come from fast fingers alone. It comes from a heart that has felt things deeply. It comes from a soul that has collected stories. It is built from joy and pain, from loss and hope, all mixed together and poured out through the instrument. Leo built the music to a soaring peak. The melody rose high and clear, full of light and a hard-won peace. It was a triumphant sound, but a quiet, personal triumph. The kind you feel when you have finally made peace with your past. Then gently he began to bring it back down. The river of sound narrowed. The walking bass line softened its steps, and the music returned to a single, simple version of that first, haunting melody. The final notes were played with a tenderness that was almost too much to bear. They were soft, clear, and full of a deep, deep love. And then there was silence. It was a perfect, unbroken silence. No one clapped. No one coughed. No one moved. It was a silence of respect, a silence of awe. It was a silence that was, in its own way, louder than any applause. The sound was gone, but the feeling it left behind hung in the air, touching everyone in the room. In that profound quiet, the young pianist finally understood. He had been silenced. Not by someone better, but by a truth he had never seen before. The masterpiece was complete, and it had rewritten the story of the entire night. The silence in the room was a living thing. It was heavy, full of the echo of the music that had just ended. For a long moment, no one even seemed to breathe. The spell that the old janitor had woven with his fingers was still wrapped tightly around everyone. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, the spell broke. The sound that erupted was not just applause. It was a thunderclap. It was a wave of pure, shocked admiration that crashed over the room. People jumped to their feet, their chairs scraping loudly against the wooden floor. They weren't just clapping. They were stomping their feet, whistling through their teeth, shouting words of praise that got lost in the roar. The noise was so sudden and so powerful it seemed to shake the very walls of the velvet note. On the stage, Leo slowly opened his eyes. He looked out at the standing, cheering crowd, and a look of mild surprise crossed his face as if he had forgotten they were there. He looked down at his own hands, resting now on his knees as if seeing them for the first time. The magic was gone from them, and they were just the rough, tired hands of a working man again. He stood up from the piano bench. The movement was slow, a little stiff. He did not smile. He did not bow. He simply gave one small, humble nod of his head towards the audience. It was a gesture of thanks, but also a gesture of an ending. The performance was over. The moment was over. He turned and stepped off the stage, his work shoes making a soft sound on the wooden steps. The crowd continued to roar, their applause following him as he walked. He didn't look left or right. He didn't stop to accept a handshake or a pat on the back. He just walked, his eyes on the floor ahead of him, moving through the crowd like a ghost. He walked straight towards the back of the room, towards his mop and bucket that were still waiting in the corner, forgotten. As he passed the young pianist, he did not pause. He did not glance in his direction. He offered no smile of victory, no look of "I told you so." He simply moved past him as if he were just another piece of the furniture. And that was what hurt the most. The young pianist stood frozen in the middle of the roaring, celebrating room. He was an island of stillness in a sea of movement. He could feel the applause vibrating through the floor, but to him it felt like it was happening in another world, far away. His eyes were fixed on the space where Leo had just been. He could still see the man's retreating back. He replayed the moment Leo walked past him. The complete absence of any acknowledgement. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pride. It was nothing. It was as if the young man and his earlier laughter were so unimportant, so small, that they weren't even worth remembering. That was the final, crushing lesson. He had been not only outperformed but entirely overlooked. The young man's friend grabbed his arm, his face flushed with excitement. "Did you hear that? Unbelievable!" Where did he learn to play like that? The young pianist just shook his head, unable to form words. The noise of the crowd began to slowly die down, turning into a buzzing hum of excited conversation. People were talking animatedly, gesturing towards the stage, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. But the young man heard none of it. All he could hear was the ghost of his own voice, his chuckle, his joke about the bleach on the ivories. The memory was like a sharp pain in his chest. He had stood in this very room so sure of his own place in the world, so sure of his talent. He had looked at the old janitor and seen nobody. He had judged a man by his job, by his rough hands and his quiet nature. And he had been wrong in the worst way possible. He thought he knew what music was. He thought it was about technique and speed and impressing people. But Leo had shown him that music was about truth. It was about life. It was about taking all the joy and all the sorrow you have collected and turning it into something beautiful that you can share. He looked towards the back of the room. Leo had picked up his mop and was slowly, quietly starting to clean a table. The spotlight was off. The magic was gone. The master had returned to his work. The young man did not go over to him. He did not try to apologize. What words could possibly be enough? An apology would be for his own benefit, to make himself feel better. He knew deep down that Leo didn't need to hear it. The music had said everything that needed to be said. Slowly, the young man turned and walked towards the door. The night air outside was cool and fresh. He stood on the quiet street looking back at the glowing sign of the Velvet Note. He felt different. He felt like the person he was when he walked in had been left behind inside. He thought about the piano in his small apartment. He thought about the difficult, flashy pieces he practiced for hours. He knew he would still play them, but now he would approach them differently. He would search for the story in them. He would try to find the feeling. He had learned that the true master isn't the one who makes the most noise. The true master is the one who creates the deepest silence after he finishes. A silence that is full of meaning. A silence that changes you. He walked away from the club, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. The city sounds surrounded him once more, but inside his head it was quiet. He was carrying the silence with him, and for the first time he understood that it was a gift. It was the beginning of learning how to truly listen.